Thanks, Anya. Okay, so let's start the session. Our first speaker is Dr. Eun-ji Amy Kim. She has been a lecturer at Griffith University in Australia since 2020. Before that, she taught at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and also worked as a science teacher and an education consultant for many years. Her research focuses on various areas, including integrating cultural diversity in science education and applying digital technologies for civic scientific literacy education. Today, the title of our presentation is Science Teachers as Epistemic Brokers, Cross-Cultural Pedagogy in the Digital Era. Please welcome her with a big round of applause.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here and in inviting me here. It is my very first time to give a talk in Korea. So it's really nice to see many Korean professors here and also researchers and grad students here. And I'm very excited to share my perspective on my topic on cross-cultural pedagogy and also to hear your perspective on this topic as well. So I see that many of you are in biology or chemistry. Can anybody tell me what this cycle is? Oh my goodness, of course, Koreans. Whenever I give this presentation to other countries, they don't give me the answer, like TCA cycle, Krebs cycle, right? So my first major before I started as education was actually biology. So when as a learner of science education, I was introduced science in more this Krebs cycle manner. Lots of formulas, lots of cycles, so that as a learner, for me, was just more like memorizing this cycle, memorizing the formulas so that I can regurgitate those cycles and formulas to get a good grade. So that's how science was to me as a learner. So, but thankfully, or fortunately, where I did my biology degree in Canada, it's called University of Manitoba. It's right in the middle of Canada prairie. We had a course called Indigenous Science course. So basically, those courses were very different from many of university lecture courses. For instance, everything was story-based. We had lots of field work. At first, I had sort of culture shock because as a third-year biology student sitting there listening to traditional people talking about story, why do I have to, listen to this cultural story when I'm here as a third-year biology student? But later, at the end of the course, it all makes sense to me. It created a platform as a learner for me to make sense and the meaning-making process of all the science that I had learned so far. Why that science content, why that TCA cycle was important to me, why it was important for me to learn different permafrost layer, different snow layer, chemical composition, why it was important for me to learn beavers' behavior in the, making the dam and ecologies and so forth. So when I became a science teacher, I was trained as a high school science teacher in biology and chemistry. I wanted to offer this type of science that was taught to me in those courses, making science real to my students. Also making the connection between local knowledge that's happening in the local environment and traditional knowledge, as well as the global science that we talk about in we so-called the Western science, we call it. So making connections from this diverse knowledge that's coming from different places. But it was really hard for me to do that as a teacher because first, I don't know how to do it. Second, there was not a lot of resources. I guess all my professional work as a science educators I did, and now as a science researchers, led me to be interested to becoming what is happening outside. So we are now considered to be in post-truth era. How I define post-truth era is following this Godoy's and John's definition. They define post-truth as post-truth history is the communication of false information on a historical phenomenon that appeals to emotion and personal belief, where both the purveyor and the recipient are indifferent to historicity and contemptuous of expert opinion that contradicts it, and where the underlying objective is ideological and especially in support of a collective identity and a political program. We have seen this post-truth example, especially in COVID-19, because of misinformation, disinformation happening about COVID-19, there was a lack of trust to the science and science evidence from the general population. That was really concerning to me as a science educator and as a science researcher. So I don't know if it happened in Korea, in North America, we had a March for Science where a lot of scientists, science educators, and general population who argue for science-based, science evidence-based policy to have a protest. And then they have invited me to speak on behalf of science educators there. And I would love to hear what was the experience here in Korea was like during the pandemic as well. So as you can see, culture and society and science and scientific inquiry processes and science evidence-based decision-making processes and what happens after, how all those influences in the education system. That's what interests me as a researcher. So I guess I hear that a lot of you are grad students, and one of the things that I always come back is always critically examine, why am I interested in my own research interest, right? So in saying that, if you have a phone, I would love to hear from you. There's a QR code that's going to lead to a Padlet. And I don't know, for those of you are joining from the Zoom, I don't know if you can join from the QR code there. Go there and then write down 3 keywords, or if you want to use emojis, that's fine. That describes your area of research. I'll give you maybe 2 minutes. Doesn't have to be elaborated. Okay, we've got discourse and collaboration, interdisciplinary learning sciences, and we've got emojis. Something looking like DNA, brain, and what is the barcode? Does that mean digital? Can you raise your hand if that is your emoji? Yes, can you please explain what your research area is? Yeah, genetics in fruit flies. Research in neuroscience, brain, got it. And I give you a applause for being creative using the emojis. STEM career, science assessment, genetic education, social scientific issues, language, culture, history, chemistry. Wow, it looks like a lot of interesting research is happening here. I would love to hear more about your research after the talk. Please come and speak to me. So going back to the talk, when I spoke to Professor Martin about what's being done here at SNU, and she told me that there's a lot of heavy emphasis on the research and an education that's preparing for the next generation or current generation for the industry, fourth revolution, industrial revolution. Can anyone tell me what that is? We're all being shy. So we all know, like, digital technology has fundamentally reshaped how human species has interacted with the world, right? So we're not now in the era of fourth industrial revolution. So with the technology, the global market is very connected digitally in everyday basis. So you may heard of, or even using now, or maybe one of your research area is on extended reality, AI, blockchains, and so forth, right? So not only working with digital technology, citizens and workers now in the era of fourth industrial revolution needs to understand the nature of web, right? So let's talk about nature of web. Maybe you might know better than me because you're all Koreans, living in the fastest web nature of the world. So just quickly summarize the differences between web version 1, 2, 3. So web.1 is basically read only, right? So users are basically accessing photos and newspaper, and then it was decentralized, right? Now we are in web.2 2.0. So users are more participatory, right? You are sharing your own information, your own contents through Facebook, Twitter, TikToks, and Instagram. But it's centralized, it's owned by a certain company. So you need to log into the company to share your information, right? So some scholars are now saying that we are moving towards to Web 3.0. It means that there's no company, there's no, you don't need to log in. Every one of you will have your own servers. So it will become decentralized again. What that means, especially with the coming with the metaverse, virtual reality, is very significant for us to think about this new era in digital setting. So maybe you might have already played with metaverse. Basically, it's 3D virtual worlds, accessed through a virtual reality headset, where users navigate the metaverse using their eye movement, feedback controller, or voice comments. And then the headset immerses the users, and then it creates the physical sensation of what's already being there. Why is that important to us as a science education researcher? Because it's bringing us a new challenge for fourth industrial revolution as well as Web 3.0. So previous industrial revolution liberated humankind from animal power and made mass population possible and brought digital capability to billions of people. But this fourth industrial revolution, however, is fundamentally different. It is characterized by a range of new technologies that are fusing the physical, digital, and biological worlds, and impacting all disciplines, economies, industry, and even challenging ideas of what it means to be human. So let's talk about the importance of digital literacy and COVID-19. And of course, we've all witnessed that everything shift from in-person learning to online shifting. I don't need to tell you the whole story, but now digital literacy is becoming the survival skill. What was interesting to me here in Korea, when I went onto the bus or metro system, and they used the terminology of digital 약자, 와 함께하는 세상. That was very fascinating to me because in Australia and in Canada, we do talk about digital divide, but we don't really use the word digital 약자 to, I guess, talk about people who doesn't have digital literacy. So in a way, I think Korean researchers are actually step forward in thinking about digital literacy and thinking about this digital divide. So I'm eager to learn from you as well. So let's all think about, so far I talked about the importance of fourth industrial revolution, Web 3.0, digital literacy, and virtual reality. So I want to hear from you. Go into the QR code again. As an educational researcher, what would be the most challenging for science teachers work with metaverse or Web 3.0? Did you all get the QR code? Okay, one of the comments we have is cannot have actual experience, such as the lab experience. Actually, some of the metaverse already do have a virtual lab, but I guess it is not the actual results, which we will talk about in this presentation a little bit. Don't know why they use metaverse. Fair comment. Why do we need to use metaverse? Is it another shining tool? Technological issues, yes, teachers may have, how to access the technology and how to use the technology. Questions about whether scientific experiments in the metaverse will work. That's right, sense of reality. Okay, I will just wait for another 10 seconds for the comments to come. Gap of students' environment, including economic backgrounds, device platform. Yeah, the talk about digital divide, right? Who gets to have the headset, who doesn't get to have headset? Time, always an issue for teachers, right? Yeah, appropriate tools and mind. Yes, all of comments are very valid, and then I hope to touch some of that in this presentation. So when coming back to my three keywords, culture, society, science, and education, when we talk about culture and social influences in science education, now we must think about digital aspect in our research and education, because it is part of the aspect, if not the core aspect, shaping our culture, global and local culture, as well as the society, how we function as a society as well. So the overarching question that's currently guiding my research projects, I have diverse research projects that's involving culture and society and science education, is this question. In what ways can science teachers navigate diverse cultural interfaces? In this presentation, I'll give some specific case, first with indigenous knowledge or local knowledge, and Western modern science or global scientific knowledge. The second interface I'm going to briefly touch on is the physical natural world and virtual world. Some of you mentioned in Padlet, maybe one of the challenges that science teachers will face is that, sensing the reality, what will actually work in metaverse and what's not real. Actually, one of the questions that I heard from the grade 4 is that in their generation, what is real? What is real is actually one of the questions they're facing. And then in the future generation, it will be even heavily more so, if you're talking to someone on the phone, is it an AI that I'm speaking or a real person? The experiences that I'm having, is it actually constructed by AI or another person, or is it real experiences? These are some of the actual core philosophical questions that science educators as well as researchers need to consider in the new era of digital and post-truth era. So you might wonder what I mean by indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledges. It might be foreign concepts to you. So maybe I thought, just have a little clip from UNESCO. They have a project on citizen science project with the local indigenous people. So maybe let's watch that little bit. We're talking about digital tech. Oh, is it working? Oh, it's on. I don't know if the sound is on. Yeah, you could just read the caption. So basically, it's a project in Jordan. They talk to the traditional farmers, how they are incorporating, how they are practicing their know-how, and that they are now linking with global scientific scientist community, so that students can learn from the local indigenous people or local farmers from their traditional knowledge with the actual scientists, and then they can participate in scientific inquiry. That was just a little bit of snapshot of the indigenous knowledge in scientific research. So I guess I need to talk about how I am employing the term cultural interface. So I am following a Torres Strait Islander, which is one of the indigenous group in Australia, Martin Nakara's definition of it. So he mentioned that cultural interface between indigenous knowledge or local traditional knowledge and Western modern science or global scientific knowledge is a contested knowledge space wherein teachers need to ask critical questions such as which part of indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, is being included, and what ways indigenous knowledge are represented in curriculum. This is actually heavily emphasized in national Australian curriculum. This is one of our framework that's guiding our national framework, not only in science, all disciplines from science to math to English or history, we all need to include indigenous local knowledge in our teaching in Australia. And this is actually coming from the curriculum documents. They took the cultural interface into the modeling. You don't need to read too much of it, maybe just at the third cultural space. So yellow center represents the space of not knowing, and the third culture space, the black is, traditional local knowledge, and red is the modern technology and digital technology and so forth. What's important here is that the classroom, science classroom, is that yellow space where traditional knowledge or local knowledge comes in contact with the modern technology and science. And then science educator need to have conversation between traditional science, traditional knowledge, as well as digital technology. So they have a lot of job to do and so little time, as one of you mentioned in Padlet. In order for us to talk about that, I wanted us to go back to the old debate. Maybe you might have heard of it. If you haven't, maybe this will be the first time you are introduced to it. At least in the field of science education, there had been multiculturalist versus universalist debate. This debate has been going on for, I don't know, Sonia, God knows how many times. So universalists basically believe that science is cultural free canon of knowledge. Culture doesn't play a role in science. Multiculturalists, on the other hand, is science is embedded in the context of a cultural group, so all systems are therefore culture laden. So their definition is that maybe Korean traditional people might have their own science, maybe indigenous people in Australia have their own science, and then our goal is to work with this diverse different scientific knowledge systems. But then when I wrote my book, I realized that it's not polarized view, universalist versus multicultural view. There's actually diverse senses around cultural aspect of science in science education. I just wanted to just show you that this is not either or position. If you want to hear more about it, I can introduce to you my book or send you my book chapter later. This is the book that I just published last year. A little bit of self-promotion here. Thank you. I wanted to hear about your prior knowledge about cross-cultural pedagogy, but I am very short on time, so I will skip to this one. So you might wonder, okay, what exactly is cross-cultural pedagogy? How does knowledge, science, culture all intertwine? I usually give like almost a month of lecture on just topic, let alone, but just very brief summary about it so that you get to hear from the perspective from Australian and Canadian perspective. So this is Dr. Marcelo, but he's also an indigenous elder from Peru and also acknowledged as a national indigenous group in Canada as well. One of my mentor in my PhD. When I was writing my PhD, the relationship between knowledge and science was critical. Like what defines as knowledge? What defines as science? And then to that, he gave me this analogy. Hey, Amy, knowledge and science, they're not separable. They're inseparable. They always come in pair, just like cup of water. So he suggests that the reality, water is just water. Some may call it as H2O, and some may call it as spirit, but we're basically talking about same single truth, natural phenomenon. But culture is shaping science, and based on the shape of cup, the knowledge may appear differently. You might but then it's in line with other thoughts, and it's not the new thoughts. Aristotle talked about same thing. Each thing has embedded within it both potential and actuality. And also Hegel also talked about dialectic, Also there's a Marx and Engels dialectical materialism talking about things are not either or, they always go hand in hand. I will tease out how that kind of thought plays out in my other theoretical work in just a little bit. The culture, I always like to define how I use the terms so that you know where I come from. Of course, just as any other academic jargon, culture also has different definitions of it. But most of them, they all talk about the same thing. They focus on communities' understanding of nature and social interaction. So nature and social interaction plays a huge part of what considered to be a culture. So there is not only ethnic culture, not only Korean culture, Canadian culture, but science as a discipline. Biologists have their own culture, chemistry, people have their own culture, right? So in my book, I talk about dancing and amoeba. So basically talking about how knowledge and science, the social interaction happens within the discipline or within the or in between cultural group. But I'm mindful of time, so I will skip this a little bit to talk about the actual stories that I encountered in Canada. So I told you in Canada and Australia, incorporating Indigenous knowledge is a mandated national mandated curriculum. Ted is one of the science teacher I've met in Canada. So this is his actual case. In grade 10 classes, we were embarking on the concept of biotic and abiotic, non-living, not living, living and non-living, right? And I picked up a stone and I said, is this abiotic or biotic? And no one replied. And I said, well, you know, from a science perspective, this rock is abiotic. And one young man, he raised his hand and said, well, in our culture, that's wrong. The rock has a spirit. All created things have a spirit. If you were a teacher, what would you do in this case? This becomes really, really tricky, right? As a teacher, well, in the national curriculum says, well, stone is considered as abiotic. So this is what he did following the cross-cultural pedagogy. Well, think about it. Well, you kind of delve it down. It makes sense. We have calcium in our bones that comes from the earth. That's rock. We have phosphorus. All of these elements we need. You know, electrons don't fire without the elements of sodium and chlorine. The ion pumps in our nerves don't fire without those elements. And sodium is from the earth. And when you put it in that perspective, yes, rock gives life. And from their view, the earth is scared, and then rock is scared. And then obviously teaching from elders regarding the rock as a grandfather means grandfather spirit. So I see ways that we can benefit from both systems, if nothing but to teach a deeper appreciation of the land, the earth, and everything around us. So as you can see, this is how Ted actually embedded his cross-cultural pedagogy. He managed that, well, there's actually clashing worldview. You know, in the national curriculum, in the science perspective, rock is abiotic, but in their cultural perspective, rock is a living thing. And then he actually went on, you know, engaged in the social interaction with the community, right? He actually went into ceremony, went to elders helper, he sang with the drum circle. Through that, he learned the language and stories so that he can actually start making the meanings of this culture. Then, once that he did that, then he was given a permission to use the story to, you know, teach with his future student. So teachers in the cultural interface in science need another type of information and data literacy. You know, how do we access this traditional knowledge? And then how do we get to share them, right? And maybe in Korean context, it's maybe could be with Korean farmers, you know, then in what ways science teachers can gather the stories from the local community and how they can share in their classroom. And science teachers need to understand their diverse relationship at play, nature, human, and understanding their diverse labor stories. I'll just skip this. So in a nutshell, teachers as cross-cultural brokers, it's not a new concept, means that it's not only didactic ways of teaching. It's really about linking the community's cultural values, knowledge, to science, academic discipline, and knowledge and cultures, and then create that platform for, you know, students to actually navigate this diverse knowledge system. That's important. And why that is important is that we can use that same type of cross-cultural pedagogy in this digital natural interface as well, because digital in the metaverse, for example, they will have their own knowledge system that's being generated because metaverse has its own culture, right? As well as science classroom has its own culture too. So one of you mentioned in Padlet, okay, in what ways then teachers can understand what's happening in metaverse? Because the more so I'm thinking maybe hopefully in 20 or 30 years, students will actually have more digital experience than actual experience in natural spaces. Then how can teachers can bridge those knowledge that's happening in metaverse as well as that's happening in local communities? I will just mention that. So Ning and colleagues basically mentioned that in the metaverse, there's different spaces that involve cyber places, thinking space and physical space and social spaces. That's just to show you that now teachers need to navigate all this type of space that's happening in metaverse and natural spaces to teach now. How long do I have? 0 minute left. Okay, I'll be very, very quickly. So what I wanted to do was using the cultural historical activity theory. Raise your hand if you have heard of it. Yeah, a few of you. Okay, I don't need to tell you too much of it. Then basically remember that each things, they all come in pair, just like cup of water. Basically, Chet, cultural historical activity theory supports that. You know, it's a theoretical framework addressing dichotomy of individual, collective, cognitive, emotive, psychological, sociological, praxis, and theory. And in my case, nature and virtual. I wanted to show you more about how I adopted to this, but I know that there are 3 more speakers of this. So I will quickly go over just the final slides of it. So cross-cultural pedagogy in digital era, what that looks like for science teacher is actually science teacher needs to play a role of an epistemic broker. One of the example, what that looks like is science teachers can actually facilitate conversation on imagining nature, digital futures. So they can actually have a conversation to theorize virtual physical interface or even to apply hybrid pedagogy in their classroom. So in so doing, they can do so in relation to other knowledge system, you know, such as what's happening in the local community, traditional farmers or indigenous peoples, or it could be scientists or engineers' perspective exist in other curriculum spaces. Also in relation to what's past, present, and future. One of the example is future thinking using the backcasting approach. If you haven't heard of backcasting approach, that's actually being used a lot in sustainable development goal policy a lot. Backcasting approach, which includes 4 phases. First, define criteria, maybe what that digital STEM learning might look like for their classroom and their community's context. And then they get to analyze today's situation in relation to the criteria. And they envision future solutions together. And then they identify strategy. So not only theorizing it, but they actually come up with the strategies for their own learning that's connecting natural and virtual spaces together. Thank you very much. I just want to introduce that I'm currently in the 2 different projects. First one is including digital skill for indigenous learner, but I am more interested in the second one, extended reality conceptualization for science education. We're doing literature review and then creating assessment tool and application together. If that's something that you're very interested in, please let me know. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kim. Like, it was really impressive to hear about like how teachers could become cross-cultural brokers to navigate diverse cultural interfaces. So I hope to ask the audience if you have any questions to Dr. Kim, or if it's overwhelming to ask a question in front of all this audience. So you can capture this QR code with your phone and please write down your questions there, and your questions will pop up on this screen. Maybe we could try that. Yeah, let's take like 1 or 2 minutes to take this QR code or go to the slido.com and enter this number, and you could type in your question there. And while people are doing that, like if there are anyone who wants to ask a question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your lecture today. I was wondering, do you think the cross-cultural pedagogy would work in a multicultural society as well? Because what you have introduced so far seems to be where one culture dominates rather than there are like various or a handful of or multiple of different cultures present. So for example, my research area is in developing countries. So in the case of Africa, I don't think I would suspect whether this cross-cultural pedagogy would be a very useful for science teachers, because they would face more than, various and, conflicting ideas among those cultures as well as science. So do you think this cross-cultural pedagogy would also operate or work in a very multicultural society as well?
Thank you. What was your name? Sorry.
I'm Soyeon.
Soyeon, thank you so much for your question. Definitely. Actually, the origin of cross-cultural pedagogy actually comes from multiculturalism education. The origin of actually cross-cultural broker comes from anthropology, where people actually used to work with different diverse cultures. So yes, it will operate definitely. But in the context of multiculturalism and science education, there is danger, because we don't want to fall into the relativism where we accept all ideas are acceptable, even the flat earth. Then we say, oh, it's a part of a culture. They have a community group. We need to make sure that their views are included. We don't want to do that, right? So when we are doing cross-cultural pedagogy, multicultural setting definitely works, and that's where it comes from. But in the context of science education, we always need to understand that in what ways we could actually have a better communication, a better conversation, and use the cross-cultural pedagogy that actually makes sense with scientific inquiry, that's evidence-based, right? So if someone, it's okay to include cultural stories as long as they can actually showcase these were my processes that I went through to get evidence. So definitely works, but only caution is that we don't fall into the relativism. We go through we are pluralism. We understand that there are many ideas. We need to respect that, but it has to be backed up by some form of scientific inquiry processes as well as evidence. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, and I saw one question on the slide screen, so I'll quickly turn it up and ask you that question. So it says, could you give me an example of science that has characteristics of digital culture?
Okay, can you repeat that question?
Sure. Sorry, yeah. Okay, could you give us an example of science that has characteristics of digital culture?
Okay, so then we need to define what means to be as digital culture, right? And then it's probably, I think some of you are already researching about this. So in digital culture, it's not only digital technology. So let's think about metaverse. Type of digital cultures we're now thinking is what it means to be human. That's challenging, right? So when we are thinking about science education, I think some of you are researching AI. That needs to be part of the digital culture, because what is real humanness of in digital culture is very much at forefront of shaping digital culture. Okay, so what is the science that actually incorporates digital culture? That aspect that I mentioned about the fourth industrial revolution that has the AI, blockchain, extended reality, how that actually shapes our scientific inquiry process. I think some of you are studying even genetics. I even wonder the scientific culture that includes digital will actually now reshape with the consideration of this extended reality and AI and blockchain. So very good question. It's still to be explored. I think we are living the era, and I guess that's why I really appreciate SNU inviting me to have this conversation. We are the part of the community who's shaping this digital culture, especially in science education. So I'm open to have more conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.